The diner was quiet that evening, the low hum of conversation mixing with the soft clatter of silverware on plates. Regulars sat at their usual booths, sipping coffee, flipping through newspapers, or chatting about nothing in particular. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon, a familiar comfort to those who came here daily. Then the door swung open. A gust of cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the sound of deep laughter and the heavy stomp of boots. A group of bikers, dressed in leather jackets and covered in tattoos, walked in like they owned the place. Their presence changed the atmosphere instantly. Conversations quieted, and eyes darted toward them before quickly looking away. They weren't unknown to the town, troublemakers, loud, always looking for something to entertain themselves. But tonight their attention landed on a single man sitting alone in the corner booth. An elderly man, shoulders slightly hunched but posture still straight, quietly ate his meal. He wore a faded cap with military insignia embroidered on it. His hands, veined and aged, moved steadily as he cut his food with precise, practiced motions. His weathered face showed years of discipline, hardship, and a strength that time hadn't erased. One of the bikers smirked, nudging his friend. "Look at this old-timer," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. Another one chuckled. "Think he can even hear us?" The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard, sauntered over. He leaned down, hovering just over the old man's shoulder. "Hey, Grandpa," he sneered. "You waiting for someone? Or just here to waste space?" The diner fell into an uneasy silence. The old man didn't respond. He simply took another bite of his food, chewing slowly. The leader wasn't used to being ignored. His smirk faded. "Hey," he said, louder this time. "I'm talking to you." Still, the old man remained calm. He didn't even look up. The biker's patience snapped. He reached forward and snatched the cap off the table, twirling it in his fingers. "What's this? Some kind of souvenir? Bet you weren't even in the military. Just wearing this for show, huh?" For the first time, the old man stopped eating. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, set it down carefully, and looked up. His gaze met the biker's, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his aged eyes, something cold, unwavering, unafraid. "You done?" the veteran asked, his voice quiet, steady. The biker laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, we just got started." The other bikers chuckled, watching the scene unfold like it was entertainment. The waitress, a young woman in her 20s, looked nervous, but too scared to interfere. A couple of the regulars shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one dared to step in. The old man exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number and pressed it to his ear. For a few seconds, he simply listened. Then he spoke. "It's me," he said. "I need you to come down to Joe's diner." His voice remained calm, but there was something about the way he said it that sent a ripple through the room. The biker scoffed. "Who are you calling? Your grandkids? Some old war buddies?" The old man didn't answer. He put his phone down, folded his hands over the table, and looked up at the man standing over him. "You should finish your business here quickly," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Because you won't like what happens next." The biker's smirk faltered for the first time. Outside, the sound of distant engines rumbled through the night. And then, the diner door creaked open again. The sound of the diner's door swinging open sent a hush through the room. The bell above it gave a weak chime, but it wasn't the noise that caught everyone's attention, it was the men stepping inside. They weren't rowdy. They weren't loud. They didn't wear leather jackets covered in skulls or chains. But their presence alone was enough to change the atmosphere. 4 men entered first. Then 5 more. They weren't young, but they weren't weak. Some had gray in their hair, others had deep lines on their faces that spoke of years most couldn't comprehend. Their jackets bore patches, not gang insignias, but military emblems. Some had medals pinned to their chests. They moved with purpose, with discipline, like men who had walked into chaos before and knew exactly how to handle it. The old veteran, still seated, barely moved his head. But a slow, knowing smile touched his lips. The lead biker, the one who had been smirking and taunting just moments before, suddenly found himself shifting uneasily on his feet. His fingers still gripped the stolen military cap, but now, it felt heavier in his hands. One of the older men, a towering figure with broad shoulders, scanned the room with sharp eyes. His gaze landed on the old veteran, then flicked to the bikers. He didn't say anything, but his presence alone spoke volumes. The diner, once filled with quiet chuckles and mocking tones, now felt like a battlefield where no one had fired a shot, yet. The lead biker forced a laugh, though it sounded strained. "What's this?" he asked, motioning toward the newcomers. "You call the Senior Citizen Club?" No one laughed. The old veteran finally moved. He pushed his plate to the side and slowly stood, his back straight, his eyes steady. The years on his face didn't weigh him down, instead, they made him seem taller, stronger. "I told you," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "You wouldn't like what happens next." The lead biker glanced around at his men, as if expecting backup, but even they seemed unsure. The room had shifted. Whatever power he thought he had was slipping away fast. One of the older men stepped forward. His hair was cropped short, his posture stiff with discipline. His voice was gravelly, the kind that had given orders in places far more dangerous than this. "You think you're tough?" he asked, his eyes locked onto the lead biker. "You think picking on an old man makes you a man?" The biker swallowed, but forced a smirk. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "No, you don't," the older man said, stepping closer. "But you should understand something. The man you just disrespected? He's earned more honor in a single day than you will in your entire life." The lead biker snorted, trying to regain his confidence. "What's your deal, huh? You all just gonna stand here and give me a history lesson?" One of the other veterans, a man with a deep scar running down his cheek, finally spoke. "You ever serve, son?" The biker's jaw clenched. The room was silent. The veteran watched him carefully, then nodded slightly. "I see it," he murmured. "You did, didn't you?" The lead biker stiffened. His men glanced at him, surprised. The scarred veteran took another step forward. "Which branch?" The lead biker hesitated, then let out a short breath. "Army." A ripple of recognition passed through the group of older men. Some nodded, others simply stared at him with unreadable expressions. "Then you should know better," the scarred man said quietly. "You should know what it means to wear that cap." His eyes flicked to the veteran's stolen military hat, still clutched in the biker's hand. "And you should know what it means to take it off a man who's given more than you can imagine." The lead biker opened his mouth, but no words came. The veteran he had been mocking all evening finally spoke again. "How long did you serve?" The biker hesitated. 4 years. The old man nodded. "And then?" A shadow passed over the biker's face. "And then I left." A heavy pause filled the room. The old veteran studied him for a moment, then spoke, his voice softer now. "You lost your way." The biker's fingers curled around the cap, his knuckles turning white. "You forgot who you were," the old veteran continued. "You forgot what it meant to stand for something." The lead biker inhaled sharply, as if about to argue, but nothing came out. His men were watching him now, waiting for him to respond. The old man stepped closer, and despite his age, his presence towered over the younger man. "I didn't call these men to fight you," he said. "I called them to remind you." The diner was dead silent. "You think you're a leader?" the old veteran asked. "Then lead. Show your men what it means to be better. Show them what it means to respect those who've walked before you." The lead biker stared at him, his breathing uneven. Then, slowly, his fingers uncurled. He looked down at the cap in his hand, then at the man he had taken it from. A long pause. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and held out the cap. The old man took it. The room remained still. Then, finally, the old veteran gave a small nod. Good. The tension in the diner eased. The lead biker swallowed hard, then turned to his men. "Let's go," he muttered. But as he reached the door, he hesitated. Then he turned back. He stopped himself, then tried again. "I was wrong." The old veteran didn't reply. He didn't need to. The message had already been received. The bikers had left, but the tension in the air still lingered. The old veteran stood quietly for a moment, watching the door swing shut behind them. The diner, once buzzing with low murmurs and casual conversation, remained eerily silent. The group of veterans who had arrived at his call didn't speak either. They knew this wasn't over. The old man ran a hand over the cap that had been taken from him. He brushed away an invisible speck of dust, then placed it gently back on the table. His fingers traced the worn fabric, the embroidered insignia that represented more than just his time in service. It represented every brother he had fought beside, every loss he had endured, every moment of sacrifice. A soft clatter broke the silence. The young waitress, still visibly shaken, had dropped a tray of empty glasses. She mumbled an apology and bent down quickly to gather them. One of the older veterans, a man with silver hair and a quiet, steady presence, stepped forward to help her. "You all right, miss?" he asked in a low voice. She nodded quickly, though her hands trembled as she picked up the last glass. I just didn't know what to do," she admitted. "I wanted to say something, but," the old veteran finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You did the right thing by staying out of it." She looked at him, eyes full of uncertainty. "But," he shook his head. "This wasn't your fight." The other veterans nodded in agreement. One of them, a man with a deep voice and a strong presence, crossed his arms and exhaled. "Those boys were looking for a reaction," he said. "You step in too soon, and you just give them what they want." The young woman hesitated, then slowly nodded. "I guess she bit her lip. I hate seeing people treated like that." The old veteran gave a small, approving nod. "So do we." Another veteran, a man with a thick mustache and a hardened look, let out a quiet chuckle. "I was half expecting them to try something dumb," he admitted. "But you handled it better than I would have." He glanced at the old veteran. "You always were the patient one." The old man gave a small smile, but didn't respond. Instead, he slowly sat back down, adjusting his cap before picking up his coffee cup. He took a sip, then set it down carefully. "I knew he'd been in the service," he said after a moment. The others turned to look at him. The veteran who had helped the waitress raised an eyebrow. "The biker?" The old veteran nodded. It was in his eyes. He exhaled. He was lost. I could see it. The scarred veteran, the one who had first challenged the biker, leaned on the counter. "And what do you think now?" The old man was silent for a long moment. Then he glanced toward the diner door. "I think he'll be back." The others exchanged looks, but didn't argue. They had seen men like that before, men who had left the service, but never truly found their place in the world again. Some found peace. Others found trouble. And some just needed a reminder of who they really were. A quiet hum of conversation returned to the diner as the regulars slowly resumed their meals. The waitress, now calmer, moved from table to table, taking orders. The group of veterans stayed, ordering coffee and settling into their usual spots. But the old veteran? He simply sat in silence. His mind wasn't in the diner anymore. It was back in a different time, a different place, where the air smelled of gunpowder and dirt, where the sound of boots on the ground wasn't just from men walking into a restaurant but from soldiers marching into battle. He could still hear the voices of the men he had fought alongside, still see the faces of those who hadn't made it home. And then, just as quickly, he was back in the present. The smell of coffee. The quiet murmur of voices. The faint sound of a jukebox playing an old song in the background. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the moment. Then the diner door swung open again. The entire room turned. The lead biker stood there, hesitating in the doorway. His men weren't with him this time. He looked different, his usual arrogance was gone. There was no smirk, no swagger. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. The veteran group watched him carefully, their expressions unreadable. The young waitress, who had been wiping down a counter, froze. The biker didn't approach them right away. Instead, he walked over to the counter and ordered a coffee. His voice was quieter now, less sure of itself. The old veteran didn't say anything. He simply watched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the biker turned toward the old man's table. He hesitated again. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he approached. The diner fell silent once more. When he reached the table, he didn't sit. He didn't speak immediately either. He just stood there, as if gathering the right words. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was an idiot," he admitted, his voice rough. The old veteran studied him carefully but said nothing. The biker exhaled. "I forgot what it meant," he continued. "To be part of something bigger than myself." His jaw clenched slightly. "When I got out, I thought I didn't need anyone. Thought I could just do things my way. But I was wrong." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had already known this. The biker hesitated again. Then, finally, he spoke the words that had been sitting in his throat like a weight. "I'm sorry." The diner was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The old veteran? He simply sat in silence. His mind wasn't in the diner anymore. It was back in a different time, a different place, where the air smelled of gunpowder and dirt, where the sound of boots on the ground wasn't just from men walking into a restaurant but from soldiers marching into battle. He could still hear the voices of the men he had fought alongside, still see the faces of those who hadn't made it home. And then, just as quickly, he was back in the present. The smell of coffee. The quiet murmur of voices. The faint sound of a jukebox playing an old song in the background. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the moment. Then the diner door swung open again. The entire room turned. The lead biker stood there, hesitating in the doorway. His men weren't with him this time. He looked different, his usual arrogance was gone. There was no smirk, no swagger. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. The veteran group watched him carefully, their expressions unreadable. The young waitress, who had been wiping down a counter, froze. The biker didn't approach them right away. Instead, he walked over to the counter and ordered a coffee. His voice was quieter now, less sure of itself. The old veteran didn't say anything. He simply watched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the biker turned toward the old man's table. He hesitated again. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he approached. The diner fell silent once more. When he reached the table, he didn't sit. He didn't speak immediately either. He just stood there, as if gathering the right words. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was an idiot," he admitted, his voice rough. The old veteran studied him carefully but said nothing. The biker exhaled. "I forgot what it meant," he continued. "To be part of something bigger than myself." His jaw clenched slightly. "When I got out, I thought I didn't need anyone. Thought I could just do things my way. But I was wrong." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had already known this. The biker hesitated again. Then, finally, he spoke the words that had been sitting in his throat like a weight. "I'm sorry." The diner was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The old veteran studied him for a long moment. Then he gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit," he said simply. The biker hesitated, then pulled out the chair and sat down. The old man took a sip of his coffee, then looked at the younger man in front of him. "You ready to listen now?" he asked. The biker nodded. The old man gave a small smile. "Good. Because I have something to teach you." The biker sat stiffly in the chair across from the old veteran, his fingers wrapped around the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He wasn't drinking it. He barely even looked at it. His gaze was fixed downward, staring at the table, as if unsure of what to say next. The old veteran, however, was in no rush. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table, his expression unreadable. The other veterans in the diner watched in silence, their eyes flicking between the two men. They knew when to step in and when to let a man work through something on his own. Finally, the old man spoke. "You ever hear the story of the young soldier and the storm?" The biker's brow furrowed slightly. He shook his head. The veteran nodded, as if he expected that answer. He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down carefully. "There was a young soldier once," he began, his voice calm and steady. "Fresh out of training. Thought he was invincible. Thought he didn't need anyone but himself." He paused, his eyes scanning the biker's face. Then, one night, his unit was sent on a mission. A simple one, or so they thought. But the weather turned bad. A storm rolled in, and suddenly, that simple mission wasn't so simple anymore. The biker shifted slightly in his seat, listening. "The young soldier thought he could handle it alone," the veteran continued. "He broke away from his unit, thinking he'd find his way faster if he wasn't slowed down by the others. But the storm only got worse. The rain was so thick he could barely see his own hands in front of him. The wind howled so loud he couldn't hear his own breath." The old man leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to pull the biker in closer. "He got lost. Completely turned around. No matter which direction he went, it felt like he was walking in circles. And for the first time in his life, he was scared." The biker swallowed, but he said nothing. The hours dragged on. His energy drained. He started thinking maybe he wasn't going to make it out of that storm. The veteran exhaled, shaking his head slightly. And then, just when he thought he was done for, he saw something. A light. Faint, flickering, but there. It was his unit. They'd been searching for him the whole time. They hadn't left him behind, even though he'd walked away from them. The old man sat back again, watching the younger man carefully. "They pulled him back in," he said. "They reminded him that a soldier doesn't stand alone. That no matter how strong you think you are, you'll never be stronger than the men who have your back." A long silence stretched between them. The biker stared at the table, his jaw tight. His fingers tapped against the side of his coffee cup, the only indication that the story had hit somewhere deep inside him. After a moment, he let out a short, quiet breath. "That soldier was you, wasn't it?" he asked. The old veteran smiled slightly. "Could have been. Could have been any one of us sitting here." He glanced around at the other veterans, who nodded in quiet agreement. "The point is, we all lose our way sometimes. The question is, do you find your way back?" The biker's throat moved as he swallowed. He shifted in his seat, rubbing the back of his neck. "I left the army because I thought I'd had enough of rules, orders, being told where to go and what to do," he admitted. "Thought I could build something on my own. Didn't think I needed anyone." His voice lowered. "Turns out, I didn't know a damn thing." The old man didn't respond right away. He let the words settle. "I see a lot of good men lose their way when they take that uniform off," he finally said. "Some turn bitter. Some turn reckless. And some, like you, try to act like they don't care, but deep down, they do." The biker exhaled sharply. "I didn't want to care." His voice was tight, controlled. Caring meant remembering. And remembering meant thinking about the men who didn't make it home. The old veteran nodded slowly, as if he understood every unspoken word behind that sentence. "You think ignoring it makes it easier?" he asked. The biker's fingers tightened around his cup. "It did for a while." "And now?" A long pause. Then, finally, the biker let out a shaky breath. "Now I don't know." The diner remained quiet, the tension no longer from hostility, but from something deeper. Something unspoken. One of the other veterans finally broke the silence. "You got two choices, son." The biker looked up. "You keep running from it. Pretend none of it mattered. Keep filling your life with noise, to drown out what you don't want to hear." The veteran leaned forward. "Or you face it. Accept that what you did, what you were part of, means something." The biker's gaze flicked back to the old veteran, who nodded. "The past doesn't go away just because you ignore it," he said. "But it doesn't have to control you, either." The biker let out a slow breath. His shoulders, which had been tense since he walked in, seemed to relax just slightly. Then, after a long moment, he gave a small nod. "I think I've been running long enough." The old veteran nodded in approval. "You got a lot to make up for," one of the other veterans pointed out. The biker smirked, though it was small. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." The old veteran leaned forward slightly, tapping a finger against the table. "Then start here," he said. The biker raised an eyebrow. "Here?" The old veteran nodded toward the counter, where the waitress was still working. "You disrespected this place," he said simply. "Made people feel afraid when they didn't need to be." He raised an eyebrow. "Make it right." The biker hesitated, then glanced over at the young waitress. A pause. Then, slowly, he stood. The other veterans watched as he walked toward the counter, his steps hesitant at first, then steadier. When he reached the waitress, she turned, clearly unsure of what to expect. The biker cleared his throat. "Hey," he started, rubbing the back of his neck. He hesitated, then met her eyes. I was an idiot earlier." She didn't say anything right away. He exhaled. "I was wrong. And I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay." He nodded, glancing down at the counter. "Let me pay for my guy's coffee from earlier," he said. "And whatever else we owe." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded again. "All right." The biker reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. As he handed her a few bills, he glanced back at the old veteran. The veteran gave a small nod of approval. The biker turned back to the waitress. "And, he cleared his throat. Thanks for not throwing me out when I deserved it." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Maybe next time, don't give me a reason to." The biker chuckled quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe next time." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the table. The old veteran watched him closely. "Feels better, doesn't it?" The biker exhaled. "Yeah," he admitted. "It does." The old man nodded. "Then let's see what else we can fix." The diner settled into a strange quiet after the biker's apology. The tension that had once filled the space had faded, but something else had taken its place, something heavier, something deeper. It wasn't just about what had happened tonight. It was about what had been left unsaid for years. The old veteran sat back in his seat, watching the biker as he returned from the counter. The younger man's shoulders weren't as tense now, but there was still a weight in his posture, something he carried long before he ever walked into this diner. The biker sat down across from the old man once again, exhaling slowly. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. The veteran tilted his head slightly, studying him. "That's up to you." The biker gave a short laugh, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Yeah. That's what they told me when I got out, too. It's up to you now. Go find your own way." He shook his head. "Didn't really work out the way I thought it would." The older veterans around the diner nodded slightly. They'd seen it before. They'd lived it before. It never does, the scarred veteran at the counter said, stirring his coffee. 1 minute, you're following orders. The next, you're on your own, and no one's telling you what to do anymore. The biker ran a hand over his face, exhaling. At first, I thought that was a good thing. Thought I was finally free. No more rules, no more missions. Just me, doing whatever the hell I wanted. He scoffed, shaking his head. Turns out, I was lost and didn't even know it. The old veteran gave a small nod. Most men don't realize they're lost until they hit a wall. The biker's fingers tapped against the table. Yeah. Well, I hit that wall pretty hard. A silence stretched between them. Then, after a long moment, the old veteran asked, "What happened after you got out?" The biker hesitated, then sighed. I tried to keep busy. Got a job here, another job there. Didn't stick to any of them. Couldn't find a reason to care. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the coffee cup. Started hanging around the wrong crowd. Not because I wanted trouble, but because they didn't expect anything from me. I could just exist. No rules. No responsibilities. The old veteran's eyes stayed locked on him. And that worked? The biker let out a short, bitter laugh. For a while. Then the anger kicked in. The other veterans exchanged glances. They knew that part all too well. What kind of anger? The old veteran asked, though he already knew the answer. The biker's jaw clenched slightly. At myself. At the world. At everything. His fingers curled into a fist on the table. I did everything they told me to do. I trained hard, I served my time, and then, nothing. Just tossed back into a world that didn't feel like it needed me anymore. He shook his head. I felt useless. The old man exhaled slowly. That's the hardest part. The biker nodded. Yeah. And when you feel useless, you start doing stupid things, just to feel something again. He gestured toward the door where his crew had left. I fell in with them. They were like me, angry, lost, just drifting through life. We weren't out robbing banks or hurting people. Just making noise. Stirring things up. Trying to prove we were still here. A heavy silence settled over the table. Finally, the old veteran spoke. You know what your problem was? The biker looked at him, waiting. You didn't have a mission anymore, the old man said. You went from knowing exactly who you were to having no idea. And instead of finding a new purpose, you let yourself float. The biker scoffed. Yeah, well, nobody tells you how to find that purpose. They just send you home and hope you figure it out. One of the other veterans spoke up. No one's gonna hand you a mission. You have to build it yourself. The biker leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. And how the hell do you do that? The old veteran took another sip of his coffee before setting the cup down with a quiet clink. He met the younger man's eyes. You stop looking for the man you used to be, he said. And you start building the man you need to be now. The biker frowned slightly. The old man continued. You're never going to be that soldier again. You're not in the service anymore. You don't have a rank, you don't have orders, and you don't have a war to fight. He leaned forward slightly. But that doesn't mean you don't have a battle. The biker's throat worked as he swallowed. What kind of battle? The old veteran's expression softened just slightly. The battle to be better than the man you were yesterday. The biker exhaled through his nose. He looked away for a moment, thinking. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. So where do I start? The old man smiled faintly. Start by doing the hard thing. The biker raised an eyebrow. And what's that? The old man nodded toward the diner owner, who was wiping down the counter, pretending not to listen. You disrespected this place, the veteran said simply. Not just tonight. Over time. You and your crew made people nervous. Made this place feel less like a home for some of the people who come here. He gestured toward the waitress, who was still eyeing the biker cautiously. You start by fixing that. The biker exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Right. You say you don't have a mission anymore? The old man continued. Then here's one: start small. Start right here. Earn back the respect you threw away. The biker let out a breath. And after that? The old veteran smiled slightly. Then we'll talk about the next step. The biker studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he stood. He walked toward the counter where the owner was working. The man looked up, raising an eyebrow. The biker hesitated, then spoke. I want to make things right. The owner's expression didn't change. He simply wiped down the counter one last time before setting the rag down. Then prove it. The biker gave a small nod. All right, he said. I will. The old veteran watched him go, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He knew what was coming next. Because the first step to redemption wasn't just admitting your mistakes. It was proving you were willing to fix them. The diner remained quiet as the biker stood by the counter, the weight of his own words settling in. The owner, a man who had seen more troublemakers come and go than he cared to count, simply crossed his arms and waited. The biker exhaled. What do you want me to do? The owner studied him for a moment. Then, without a word, he reached under the counter and pulled out a rag, tossing it onto the surface between them. Start by cleaning the tables. The biker blinked, clearly caught off guard. You serious? The owner's expression didn't change. You want to make things right? Then earn it. The biker glanced toward the old veteran, who had remained seated at his booth, sipping his coffee with a knowing look. The other veterans were watching too, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, the biker considered walking out. His pride screamed at him to leave, to pretend none of this mattered. But then he thought about the past few years. About how nothing had mattered. Maybe it was time for that to change. Without another word, he grabbed the rag. The owner nodded toward the nearest booth. Start there. The biker hesitated for only a second before moving toward the booth, wiping down the table in slow, uncertain motions. The regulars in the diner watched in stunned silence. A man who had once walked in here like he owned the place was now cleaning tables like a busboy. The old veteran smiled to himself. He'd seen men change before. It never happened all at once. It started with a decision. A small, uncomfortable step in the right direction. One of the veterans at the counter chuckled. Didn't expect to see this tonight. The old man took another sip of his coffee. Neither did he. The biker worked his way through the diner, scrubbing each table without complaint. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The regulars slowly returned to their conversations, but the tension in the air had shifted. When he reached the old veteran's booth, he paused. The veteran raised an eyebrow. You gonna clean this one too? The biker smirked slightly. You're still sitting at it. The old man nodded. That's right. And when you're done here, you're gonna do something harder. The biker wiped down the table next to him. And what's that? The old veteran leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're going to talk to your crew. The biker's hand froze. He straightened, looking at the older man. And say what? The veteran shrugged. The truth. The biker scoffed, shaking his head. You don't know them. They're not gonna care. The old man studied him for a moment. Then why do you? The biker hesitated. They listened to you before, the veteran continued. You led them, even if you didn't realize it. If you change, they'll notice. The biker exhaled, tossing the rag onto the counter. And if they don't? The old veteran met his gaze. Then you walk away. The biker's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew the old man was right. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who made it easy to stay lost. If they weren't willing to change, then he had to decide if he was strong enough to leave them behind. The owner walked back over and nodded toward the rag. "Not bad," he said. "But respect isn't earned in a night. You want to make up for the way you've treated this place? Come back tomorrow. Work the morning shift." The biker looked at him in surprise. "You want me to work here?" The owner shrugged. "You said you wanted to fix things. I'm giving you a chance." The biker glanced at the old veteran, who simply raised his coffee cup in silent approval. A long pause. Then, finally, the biker nodded. "All right. I'll be here." The owner extended a hand. The biker hesitated, then shook it. The deal was made. As the biker turned back toward the old veteran, something inside him felt different. He didn't know if this was redemption, or just the beginning of something new. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. And that was enough. The morning came faster than the biker expected. The sun had barely risen when he pulled up to the diner, the old neon sign flickering weakly against the early light. It had been years since he had willingly woken up this early, for anything. A part of him wondered why he was even doing this. Then he thought of the old veteran. The look in his eyes, the way he had spoken to him, not with judgment, but with the kind of quiet wisdom that came from experience. And for some reason, that had mattered. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The diner was nearly empty except for the owner, who was already behind the counter, filling a fresh pot of coffee. He glanced up when he heard the door open. "You're early," the owner said. The biker shrugged. "Figured if I was gonna do this, might as well do it right." The owner smirked slightly. "We'll see." He handed the biker an apron. The younger man stared at it for a moment, then sighed and put it on. For the next few hours, he did everything the owner asked, wiping tables, refilling coffee, bringing out plates from the kitchen. It was simple work, nothing like the life he had been living. And yet, as the hours passed, he started to notice something. People weren't looking at him the way they used to. They weren't watching him with wariness, waiting for trouble. They weren't shifting uncomfortably when he walked past. For the first time in years, he wasn't being treated like a problem. He was just part of the place. Around noon, the door swung open, and the old veteran walked in. He moved slowly, but his posture was still straight, his steps measured. He glanced around the diner, nodding slightly as he took in the scene. Then his eyes landed on the biker. "You stuck around," the veteran said as he slid into his usual booth. The biker smirked, wiping his hands on a towel. "Figured I'd give it a shot." The old man nodded approvingly. "Good." The biker grabbed a coffee pot and poured the veteran a fresh cup. "Been thinking about what you said," the biker admitted, setting the cup down. The old man raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" The biker leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "About having a mission." The old man nodded. "And?" The biker exhaled, glancing around the diner. "This isn't it." "Not completely." He ran a hand through his hair. "But it's a start." The weeks passed. The biker kept his promise. He showed up every morning, worked the shifts, learned the job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And slowly, things began to change. The regulars started greeting him when he walked in. The waitress, who had once been nervous around him, now joked with him at the counter. Even the owner, who had been skeptical at first, began to trust him. But the biggest change wasn't how the town saw him. It was how he saw himself. One evening, after the last customer had left, the old veteran stayed behind, sipping his coffee as the biker wiped down the counter. "You thinking about what's next?" the old man asked. The biker nodded. "Yeah." He leaned against the counter. "I don't know what it is yet, but I know I don't want," the old man smiled slightly. "That's all it takes." For the first time in years, the biker felt something shift inside him. A direction. A purpose. Maybe he wasn't meant to stay here forever. Maybe this was just the first step toward something bigger. But for now, it was enough. And sometimes, starting over was the bravest thing a man could do. The weeks passed. The biker kept his promise. He showed up every morning, worked the shifts, learned the job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And slowly, things began to change. The regulars started greeting him when he walked in. The waitress, who had once been nervous around him, now joked with him at the counter. Even the owner, who had been skeptical at first, began to trust him. But the biggest change wasn't how the town saw him. It was how he saw himself. One evening, after the last customer had left, the old veteran stayed behind, sipping his coffee as the biker wiped down the counter. "You thinking about what's next?" the old man asked. The biker nodded. "Yeah." He leaned against the counter. "I don't know what it is yet, but I know I don't want to go back to how things were." The old veteran nodded. "Good." The biker hesitated. "I screwed up a lot," he admitted. The old man met his gaze. "So did I." The biker frowned slightly. "Yeah, but," the veteran held up a hand. "Listen to me, son. Every man screws up. Every man makes mistakes. But the ones who matter? They're the ones who get back up." The biker swallowed. The old veteran smiled slightly. "You're getting back up." For a moment, the younger man didn't say anything. He just let the words settle. Then, finally, he nodded. The old veteran stood, placing a few bills on the counter for his coffee. "You ever need direction, you know where to find me." The biker smirked. "Yeah?" The veteran patted his shoulder. "Yeah." And with that, he turned and walked toward the door. As the bell above the entrance chimed, the biker exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't running. And that was the biggest victory of all. The weeks turned into months. The biker never missed a shift. At first, people had watched him with skepticism, waiting for him to slip back into his old ways. But he didn't. He showed up early, worked hard, and kept to himself. He didn't demand respect, didn't try to prove anything, he just did the job. And that, more than anything, started to change how people saw him. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the old veteran walked into the diner like he always did. The biker was behind the counter, refilling the coffee pots, and when he saw the man, he gave a small nod. The old man took his usual seat. The biker grabbed a fresh cup and poured him a coffee before setting it down in front of him. "Busy night?" the veteran asked. The biker exhaled. "A little. You just missed a rush." The old man chuckled. "Good. I hate waiting for my coffee." The biker smirked. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was comfortable. Then, finally, the veteran set his cup down.